At 2:17 a.m., the monitors were flat. No heart rate, no oxygen, no movement. She was legally dead. I had already documented the time, shut down the equipment, and stepped back from the bed. Then her eyelids moved. Not wide, not dramatic, just enough to make my stomach drop because nothing is supposed to move after that point, especially not when you've done this job long enough to know exactly what death looks like. That moment is why I'm telling this story. Not because I scare easily, not because I believe in ghosts, but because I've worked in hospitals and hospice care for over 20 years and I know what should and should not happen at the end of a life. And what I saw that night did not fit anywhere in my training, my experience, or my understanding of medicine. If you've ever worked night shifts in a hospital or hospice, or if you've seen something you couldn't explain, leave a comment below. And if you want more real nurses, stories, and hospital experiences like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Now let me explain who I am because that matters. My name is Karen Whitfield. I'm 48 years old and I'm a registered nurse. I spent most of my career working in hospitals before moving into hospice and palliative care. Emergency rooms, med-surg floors, oncology units. I've seen people die fast, slow peacefully, and violently. I've watched doctors pronounce time of death hundreds of times. Death stopped being shocking a long time ago. It became procedural. That's what hospice is, whether people like hearing it or not. Hospice isn't about saving lives. It's about managing symptoms and keeping people comfortable while their bodies shut down. There's a lot of paperwork, a lot of medication schedules, and a lot of quiet rooms with dim lights. It's calm, predictable, controlled, or at least that's what I believed before that night. I was working at Silver Willows Hospice Center just outside Springfield, Missouri. It's a small facility, one-floor private rooms, nothing fancy. We serve patients who are actively dying, usually with a prognosis of weeks or less. Night shifts there are slow, families go home, phones stop ringing. You hear monitors, oxygen machines, and the occasional cough echoing down the hallway. I worked nights because I was good at it. I stayed calm. I didn't panic. And I didn't mind being alone. Most nurses don't last long on overnight hospice shifts. It messes with your sleep, your head, and your sense of time. But I like the quiet, less drama, fewer people telling you how to do your job. That shift started like every other one. I clocked in at 11, got report from the day, nurse reviewed charts, and checked medication counts. Nothing unusual, no emergencies, no surprises. Just another night watching people slowly reach the end of their lives. One patient stood out on paper though. Eleanor Price, 82 years old, stage 4 lung cancer with metastasis, non-responsive for most of the day. The doctor's notes said she was actively dying, expected time frame less than 24 hours. No family present, comfort measures only. That description wasn't unusual. I'd seen it countless times. But when I walked into her room for the first time, something about her felt off. Not in a supernatural way, in a clinical way. She was too aware. Her eyes were open, not unfocused, not glazed over. She was staring at the ceiling like she was listening to something. Her breathing was shallow but steady. Oxygen saturation low but stable. Heart rate slow. Everything made sense medically. I introduced myself out of habit. "Hi, Eleanor, I'm Karen. I'll be your nurse tonight." She didn't respond. I adjusted her oxygen, checked her IV, and documented her vitals. Routine, mechanical. I was halfway through charting when I heard her speak. "Karen." I froze. Patients call nurses the wrong name all the time. Confusion is common at the end of life, but she said it clearly. No slurring, no guessing, just my name. I told myself, she probably saw my name badge earlier or overheard someone say it. That explanation made sense, so I accepted it and moved on. That's what you do in healthcare. You choose the explanation that lets you keep working. As the night went on, I checked on her every 30 minutes. Each time she was quieter, weaker, but still watching. Around 1:30 in the morning, she whispered again, "Don't let them take me yet." I asked her who she meant. Doctors hear that kind of thing all the time too. Patients talk about people waiting for them, loved ones, memories, hallucinations. The brain does strange things when oxygen drops. She didn't answer. She just looked at me, not pleading, not scared, just aware. I documented it as restlessness and possible terminal agitation. That's the phrase we use when we don't fully understand what's happening but need something that fits into a chart. I called the on-call doctor, Dr. Thomas Reynolds, and explained what I was seeing. He agreed with my assessment. Increase comfort meds. Keep her calm. Nothing out of the ordinary. I wanted to believe him. I followed orders. I did everything by the book. And for a while it worked. Her breathing slowed, her eyes closed. The room settled back into that familiar hospice quiet. Just before 2 in the morning, her heart rate began to drop. Gradual, expected. I pulled up a chair and stayed with her. That's part of the job. You don't let people die alone if you can help it. At 2:14 a.m., her breathing stopped. I waited, listened, checked for a pulse, nothing. At 2:17 a.m., after the required time, I documented her death. I turned off the monitor. The room went silent. I stood up ready to step out and start the next set of tasks. That's when her eyelids shifted. Just slightly. Enough to make me look back. Enough to make me question whether I had imagined it. Enough to make me stay in that room longer than I should have, staring at a woman who was no longer alive, trying to understand why something inside me was telling me that what I had just seen was not supposed to happen at all. I stayed where I was, hands resting on the rail of the bed, listening to the silence settle back into the room like it always did, telling myself there was nothing left to do except move on to the rest of my shift. That was the choice in front of me every night. Trust the process, trust the chart, trust that what I knew was enough. I straightened the sheet, checked the IV one last time, and stepped into the hallway, letting the door close softly behind me. The hallway lights were dimmed to overnight mode, the kind hospitals and hospice facilities use to keep things calm and keep patients sleeping. Everything looked normal, too normal. The nurse's station was empty, the phones quiet, the medication room locked and logged. I glanced at the clock above the desk, just past 2:20. Still hours to go before morning staff arrived. Night shifts in hospice aren't dramatic. People imagine emergencies and alarms, but most nights are slow, methodical, almost boring. You check vitals that are already failing. You adjust oxygen that won't fix anything. You document changes everyone expects. It's less like saving lives and more like managing an ending that has already been agreed upon by doctors, families, and the patient's own body. I'd worked hospital night shifts for years before moving into hospice. Trauma units, oncology floors, step-down units. Hospitals at night have a different energy than daytime. Fewer people, fewer conversations, more waiting. Hospice takes that quiet and stretches it even further. The building feels hollow after midnight, like it's holding its breath. I went back to the nurse's station and opened the charting system. Eleanor's file was still open on the screen. Time of death documented, orders complete. Everything looked clean, correct, final. That's what matters in medicine. Not feelings, not impressions, just documentation that can stand up if anyone ever asks questions. I told myself that eyelid movement was a post-mortem reflex. Muscles relax, nerves fire one last time. I'd read about it. I'd even seen minor movements before. Fingers twitching, jaws shifting. Nothing that meant anything. Nothing that required explanation beyond physiology. That explanation fit, so I used it. I saved the chart and moved on. The rest of the facility was quiet. 2 other patients were asleep, their condition stable for now. One had family sleeping in chairs, the other was sedated and breathing shallowly. I checked medications, refilled supplies, wiped down counters. Ordinary tasks meant to fill the hours and keep your mind occupied. Hospice nurses don't get the adrenaline that hospital nurses do. There's no rush to fix things. The goal is comfort, not intervention. Doctors come and go. Orders are set. Most of the responsibility falls on whoever is on shift, especially overnight. You become the final witness to a lot of lives. That's something people don't talk about. Doctors pronounce death, but nurses are the ones who stay in the room. We see the last breaths. We hear the last words. We're the ones who close the eyes, clean the body, and call the family. It becomes routine, but it never becomes meaningless. I'd always been good at separating work from emotion. That's how you survive in healthcare. You build compartments in your head and keep them sealed. Eleanor's room should have gone into the closed compartment with all the others. Instead, it kept reopening on its own. I found myself replaying the moment in my head while I restocked gloves. The way her eyelids moved, not fast, not slow, Just deliberate enough to notice. I tried to remember if I'd seen anything like that before. I couldn't recall a single instance that stuck with me this way. I checked the incident logs even though there was no incident to report. No alarms, no code, no deviation from protocol. The system showed a clean night so far. If someone reviewed this shift later, they'd see nothing unusual at all. Around 3 in the morning, I walked past Eleanor's room again. The door was closed now, a small sign outside indicating the patient had passed. That door had closed behind hundreds of patients over the years. It was meant to signal finality, a clear boundary between life and what comes after. I paused for a second longer than necessary, hand hovering near the handle, then kept walking. There was no reason to go back in, none that would make sense. Hospice work attracts a certain kind of nurse. People who can sit with discomfort, people who don't need constant validation, people who can handle the slow, unavoidable decline without trying to fix it. I'd always thought I fit that description. That night made me question it. I went back to charting, double-checking orders, reviewing lab results that no longer mattered. My brain kept reaching for logic, for something solid to hold on to. That's what medicine teaches you to do. Find the explanation, label it, move on. I reminded myself that dying brains do strange things. Hypoxia causes hallucinations. Chemical imbalances trigger confusion. Doctors talk about terminal lucidity and paradoxical awareness. None of it is neat. None of it is fully understood. That gap in knowledge exists even if people don't like admitting it. The building settled deeper into silence. Outside the parking lot, lights cast long shadows through the windows. Inside, the air felt heavy the way it sometimes does near the end of a shift when fatigue sets in and your thoughts start drifting. I checked the schedule for the rest of the week. More night shifts, more patients nearing the same outcome, more rooms that would eventually go quiet. I told myself I'd forget about Eleanor by morning, that this would fade into the background like everything else. But as I stood there alone at the nurse's station, listening to the soft hum of equipment and the distant sound of oxygen flowing, I realized something had shifted. Not dramatically, not enough to panic, just enough to make me aware that my confidence in routine had cracked. And once that happens in a hospital setting, you start paying attention to things you used to ignore. I picked up my charting tablet again and forced myself to focus on the screen, but my attention kept drifting back down the hallway to Eleanor's room. I hadn't gone back inside, and I wasn't planning to. There was no clinical reason to. Still, every time I glanced at the corridor, I half expected to see the door open, like someone had walked out without making a sound. That didn't happen, of course. Hospice doesn't work that way. Bodies stay where they are until the paperwork catches up. Around 3:30, I checked on the other patients again. Both were stable in the way hospice patients are stable, meaning nothing had changed enough to require action. One man stirred briefly and mumbled something about his wife. I adjusted his blanket and moved on. Familiar, predictable, the kind of interaction that usually grounds you. By the time 4 o'clock rolled around, fatigue started setting in. Night shifts do that to you. Your body wants to sleep, your brain wants to wander, and small things start feeling bigger than they should. That's when experience matters. You learn not to trust every thought you have at 4 in the morning. I reminded myself of that as I finished another round of documentation. Eleanor's chart was closed, finalized, complete. Nothing left to add. If anyone looked at it later, they'd see a textbook hospice death. No complications, no irregularities, exactly what families and doctors hope for. Still, her voice kept replaying in my head. Karen, not confused, not slurred, just my name spoken the way someone says it when they're sure they have your attention. Patients do pick up on more than we give them credit for. They hear conversations in hallways. They read name badges. They notice patterns. I told myself that explanation earlier, and it was still the most reasonable one available. What bothered me wasn't that she knew my name, it was the timing. She hadn't spoken all night until then, and when she did, it wasn't random. I sat down at the nurse's station and pulled up the general reference system we use for hospice education. Terminal agitation, end-of-life awareness, hypoxia-induced clarity, all well documented, all accepted. There were entire sections explaining why dying patients sometimes seem more lucid, more focused, more aware than expected. Doctors discuss it in neutral terms. Nurses learn to recognize it and manage symptoms. Families are told it's normal, comforting even, a final moment of clarity before the body gives out. That explanation should have been enough. I read through a few case summaries, skimming familiar language, increased alertness, unexpected speech, recognition of caregivers. None of it mentioned timing that precise or awareness that specific. Still, medicine isn't exact. That's something you accept early in your career or you don't last long. I closed the reference tab and leaned back in my chair. The building was quiet in that deep, late-night way that makes even your own movements sound loud. I shifted my weight and listened to the chair creak under me. I thought about all the times patients had said strange things over the years. Predictions, confessions, requests that made no sense. You learn to let those moments pass without attaching meaning to them. Otherwise, you'd drive yourself crazy. But Eleanor's words didn't feel like random noise. They felt directed, like she was responding to something I couldn't see. I checked the clock again, just after 4. Less than 3 hours until day shift. The night was almost over. That thought usually brought relief. This time it didn't. I walked back down the hallway, stopping outside Eleanor's room without really deciding to. The door was still closed. The sign hadn't moved. Everything was exactly as it should be. I didn't open it. Instead, I stood there for a moment listening, not because I expected to hear anything, just because part of me needed to confirm that silence was still silence. It was. Hospice nurses learn early on that it's easy to project your own thoughts onto situations like this. Fatigue, stress, emotional exposure, they all blur lines if you let them. That's why protocols exist. That's why charts matter more than impressions. I turned away and headed back to the station. The rest of the shift passed without incident. Morning light began creeping in through the windows, dull and gray. The building slowly woke up. Phones rang, doors opened. Day staff arrived fresh and alert, asking routine questions during handoff. I gave report like I always did. 2 stable patients, 1 death overnight. Eleanor Price, time of death 2:17 a.m. Comfort measures provided. No complications. I didn't mention the eyelid movement. I didn't mention the voice. There was no place for that in a report. No category to file it under. The day nurse nodded, thanked me, and moved on. Eleanor's chart would be reviewed, her body transferred, her room cleaned. By the end of the day, another patient would be assigned that space. I clocked out just after 7, grabbed my coat, and stepped outside. The cold air hit me harder than usual, sharp and grounding. I stood there for a moment, breathing it in, telling myself the shift was over and I was fine. On the drive home, the roads were quiet. Morning radio played softly in the background. Traffic lights changed on schedule. Everything felt aggressively normal, like the world was insisting that nothing unusual had happened. I wanted to believe that. When I got home, I kicked off my shoes, poured a cup of coffee I didn't really want, and sat at the kitchen table. That's when it hit me that I'd already started doing something I never used to do after night shifts. I was replaying details instead of letting them fade. I remembered the way Eleanor looked at the ceiling before she spoke, the pause before she said my name, the way her voice sounded less like confusion and more like recognition. Those weren't dramatic moments. They were small, subtle, easy to dismiss, which made them harder to ignore. I finished my coffee, went to bed, and eventually fell asleep, telling myself I was overthinking everything. That's what nurses do. We rationalize, we compartmentalize, we move on. Except some things don't stay compartmentalized. When I woke up later that afternoon, rested but unsettled, I checked my schedule out of habit. Another night shift was coming up soon. Same unit, same hallway, different patients. And for the first time in years, the thought of walking back into that hospice didn't feel routine anymore. I went back to work 2 nights later and told myself I was done thinking about Eleanor Price. That's how nurses survive long careers. You decide something is finished, you close the mental file, and you don't reopen it unless there's a chart audit or a lawsuit. I parked in the same lot, walked through the same automatic doors, and clocked in like I had hundreds of times before. The building smelled the same. Disinfectant, stale coffee, that faint metallic note every hospital and hospice seems to share. Familiar smells are comforting when you work in medicine. They tell you things are under control. They tell you you're still in a place governed by rules. I got report from the day nurse, reviewed the charts, and nodded in all the right places. New admissions. 1 patient declining faster than expected. No emergencies, no red flags. Eleanor's name didn't come up. She was already gone from the system, her room reassigned, her chart archived. That should have been the end of it. I started my rounds just before midnight, vitals, pain levels, medication checks, the usual rhythm. I focused on being efficient, almost mechanical, because that leaves less room for your thoughts to wander. When your hands are busy, your brain behaves. One of my patients that night was a woman in her late 70s with advanced heart failure. She was restless, shifting in bed, breathing unevenly. When I asked how she was feeling, she looked straight at me and said, "I don't want to go yet." It was a common phrase. I'd heard it dozens of times. I responded the way nurses are trained to respond: reassurance, calm voice, redirecting focus to comfort. I adjusted her oxygen, administered medication, and stayed until her breathing evened out. As I documented the interaction, a familiar term floated to the front of my mind: terminal agitation. It's a catch-all phrase doctors and nurses use when dying patients become restless, anxious, or confused near the end of life. It's real, it's well documented, it has physiological explanations involving oxygen deprivation, metabolic changes, and neurological stress. That term had always been enough for me. Later that night, I crossed paths with Dr. Thomas Reynolds during his overnight rounds. He was reviewing charts at the nurse's station, glasses perched low on his nose, coffee in hand. I respected him. He was thorough, practical, not the type to jump to conclusions. I mentioned Eleanor, casually framing it as a learning moment rather than a concern. I asked if he'd ever seen patients become unusually aware right before death. He didn't hesitate. "All the time," he said. "Terminal lucidity, agitation, end-of-life awareness. We don't fully understand it, but it's not uncommon." That answer should have settled things. It was the same explanation I'd given myself. Hearing it from a doctor reinforced the idea that nothing about my experience was extraordinary. I asked him about post-mortem movement, eyelids, muscle activity. He nodded again, unbothered. "Happens," he said. "Residual nerve firing, muscle relaxation. It doesn't mean anything clinically." Clinically, that word matters in hospitals. It's the line between what we record and what we ignore, what matters for treatment and what doesn't. I thanked him and went back to my rounds, feeling slightly embarrassed for even bringing it up. That was fatigue talking, overthinking, exactly what I'd warned myself about. The rest of the shift was busy enough to keep me occupied. One patient needed medication adjustments. Another became briefly disoriented and asked for a brother who had died years ago. Normal, expected, sad but not alarming. Still, I found myself paying closer attention than usual, watching faces longer, listening for patterns. Not because I expected something to happen, but because my confidence in automatic explanations had thinned. Around 2 in the morning, I was charting when I heard a voice down the hall. Soft, indistinct, not calling out, just talking. I paused, listening. Voices at night can travel oddly in medical buildings. Air vents carry sound, doors amplify whispers. I told myself it was a family member or another nurse. When I reached the room, the patient was asleep. No one else was there. The monitor showed steady declining vitals, nothing out of place. I stood there longer than necessary, checking numbers that didn't require checking until the quiet returned. Back at the station, I documented the interaction and moved on. I didn't note the voice. There was no checkbox for that. Hospice work trains you to ignore certain instincts. You learn to trust protocols over feelings. You learn that not every question needs an answer. That's a survival skill, not negligence. By 4 in the morning, the building felt heavier. Not threatening, just dense, like the air wasn't moving the way it should. I attributed it to fatigue and stale ventilation. Logical, boring explanations are usually the correct ones. I reviewed more charts, flipping through pages of clinical language that stripped death down to bullet points and timestamps. There was comfort in that structure. It reduced something overwhelming into manageable data. I thought again about Eleanor's words, "Don't let them take me yet." I considered how easily that phrase fit into known patterns of end-of-life anxiety. Patients fear loss of control, fear separation, fear pain. That's not mysterious, that's human. What unsettled me wasn't the content of what she said. It was the certainty in her tone, the absence of confusion. As the shift dragged on, I realized I'd stopped assuming doctors always had the full picture. Not because they were careless or uninformed, but because medicine still has blind spots, entire areas where explanations exist but feel incomplete. Morning came the way it always does, slowly, relentlessly. The building stirred back to life. Day staff arrived, handoff went smoothly. I kept my report clean and professional. Driving home, I repeated Dr. Reynolds' words in my head. Terminal agitation, residual nerve activity, not clinically significant. Those explanations made sense. I accepted them. I needed them to be true. And yet, as I pulled into my driveway and shut off the engine, I realized I had started categorizing things differently in my mind. Not as unexplainable, but as unexplained. That distinction mattered more than I wanted to admit, because once you recognize that something doesn't fully fit, you can't stop noticing how often that happens in places where life is quietly ending. I was already halfway through my shift when the rhythm of the building changed again. You get used to that as a nurse. There's a subtle shift that happens when a patient moves from declining to actively dying. Monitors don't alarm right away. Vitals don't crash dramatically. Things just slow down like the body is running out of reasons to keep going. The patient was a man in his late 70s admitted 3 days earlier with advanced liver failure. Doctors had been clear with the family, hours to days, comfort only, no interventions. By the time I took over care that night, his breathing was shallow and irregular, long pauses between each breath stretching a little further every time I looked at the monitor. I pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. That's what hospice nurses do when the end is close. You don't hover, you don't rush, you stay present. His wife had gone home to rest, trusting us to be there if anything changed. I checked his pulse. Weak, thready, still there. I adjusted his oxygen more out of habit than hope and watched his chest rise and fall. The room was quiet except for the soft hiss of airflow and the faint hum of the monitor. At 1:58 a.m., his breathing stopped for longer than usual. I waited, counted, still nothing. I checked his carotid pulse again. Gone. I watched the monitor as the heart rate flattened into a straight line. This part of the job is procedural. You don't react emotionally, you confirm. You wait the required time, you confirm again. At 2:03 a.m., amid the I pronounced time of death. I documented it immediately. Time matters. Accuracy matters, especially when families aren't present. I turned off the monitor, silencing the steady beeping that had filled the room all night. The sudden quiet was familiar, almost comforting. I stood up and smoothed the sheet over his chest, closed his eyes, checked his IV site. Everything was exactly how it should be. Then his jaw moved. Not a dramatic movement, not a gasp, just a slight shift like someone adjusting their bite. I froze, hands still resting on the bed rail. I told myself what it was before my brain could go anywhere else. Muscle relaxation, post-mortem reflex. I'd seen it before. I waited, watched. Nothing else happened. I finished my tasks, stepped out of the room, and closed the door. I didn't feel alarmed. I felt irritated with myself for even noticing. Fatigue does that, makes you question things you shouldn't. Back at the nurse's station, I documented the death and notified the appropriate contacts. Everything moved along smoothly. No complications, no questions. An hour later, I walked past the room again to place a sign on the door. As I reached for the handle, something made me pause. Not fear, awareness. I opened the door slowly. The body was still, completely. No movement, no sound. I scanned the room out of habit, monitor off, oxygen disconnected, everything correct. I was about to turn away when I noticed his eyes. They weren't open, but they weren't fully closed either, just slightly parted the way eyelids sometimes rest when muscles relax. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the sense that I was being watched. That sounds dramatic, but it wasn't. It wasn't panic or imagination running wild. It was a physical sensation, like when you walk into a room and know someone else is there even before you see them. I stepped closer to the bed, annoyed at myself for indulging the thought. I checked his pupils with my pen light. Fixed, unresponsive, dead. That should have been the end of it. As I turned to leave, his lips parted. No sound came out. No breath followed. Just a slight opening, then stillness again. I stood there, heart pounding harder than it had any right to. I waited. 30 seconds. A minute. Nothing. I told myself it was gas release. Post-mortem muscle movement, everything I'd been taught, everything doctors had explained. I repeated those phrases in my head until my pulse slowed. I closed the door and walked away. The rest of the shift blurred together, charting, cleaning, quiet conversations with day staff as they arrived. I didn't mention the jaw. I didn't mention the lips. There was nothing to mention, no deviation from protocol, no clinical significance. But as I drove home that morning, exhaustion hit me harder than usual. My hands felt tight on the steering wheel. My thoughts kept circling back to the same moment, replaying it from different angles. I'd been present at hundreds of deaths. I knew what bodies did after life stopped. I knew what was normal. This felt close enough to normal to be ignored, but different enough to stick. That afternoon, I slept poorly. Short, shallow sleep filled with half-formed thoughts. I woke up with my jaw clenched and my heart racing, the image of that slight movement still sharp in my mind. I tried to distract myself with routine, laundry, groceries, phone calls, normal life things that remind you the world keeps moving whether you're unsettled or not. Before my next shift, I reviewed hospice training materials again, not because I needed to, but because I wanted reassurance. Post-mortem changes, reflexes, muscle relaxation, all of it checked out. Nothing explained why two separate patients on two separate nights had made small, deliberate movements after death that felt different from anything I'd seen before. I told myself coincidence exists. That's another thing medicine teaches you. Patterns don't always mean anything. Humans are good at finding meaning where there isn't any. When I returned to work later that week, I did what I always did. Clocked in, reviewed charts, took report. The building felt the same. The smells, the sounds, the routines hadn't changed, but I had. I found myself watching more closely when patients neared the end, not anxiously, just attentively, waiting to see if anything else would happen that fit into that narrow space between explained and ignored. Hospice work depends on acceptance, acceptance of death, acceptance of uncertainty, acceptance that not everything needs to make sense. Standing at the nurse's station that night, listening to the quiet stretch down the hallway, I realized I was no longer sure where the line was between what we understand and what we simply choose not to look at too closely. I didn't realize how much that night had followed me home until I caught myself standing in my kitchen, staring at the microwave clock like it was trying to tell me something. It was just after 2 in the morning. I hadn't set an alarm. I hadn't woken up to noise. My body had simply decided it was time to be awake. I stood there for a minute, listening to the house settle, feeling annoyed more than afraid. Nurses don't get spooked easily. We get irritated when our sleep is interrupted for no reason. I poured a glass of water, drank it, and went back to bed, telling myself I'd fall asleep again in a few minutes. I didn't. My mind kept circling the same questions, the kind you don't ask out loud because they make you sound incompetent. Had I missed something? Had I rushed? Had I followed protocol so closely that I stopped seeing what was actually happening in front of me? Hospice nurses are trained to anticipate death, not prevent it, but we're still responsible for timing, dosing, observation. A mistake doesn't look dramatic. It looks small, subtle, easy to overlook until it's too late. I replayed Eleanor's last hours step by step, her vitals, her medications, the timing of everything, morphine dose within range, oxygen appropriate, no signs of respiratory distress that hadn't already been documented. Nothing stood out. Then I replayed the man with liver failure. Same process, same careful confirmation, same clean chart. That should have reassured me. Instead, it made me uneasy in a different way. If I hadn't done anything wrong, then the responsibility for what I'd seen didn't belong to a mistake. It belonged somewhere else. The next day, I found myself reading medical journals during lunch, not because I needed continuing education credits, but because I wanted answers. Postmortem reflexes, agonal movements, residual neural activity. I knew the terms. I'd taught them to new nurses. The explanations were technical and detached, full of phrases like involuntary and non-purposeful. They were meant to close the conversation, not open it. What bothered me was the consistency. 2 different patients, 2 different diagnoses, 2 different nights, and yet the movements had felt similar in the same unsettling way. I told myself again that similarity doesn't equal meaning. Patterns emerge everywhere if you look hard enough. That's a cognitive bias we warn patients about all the time. I went back to work that night with a kind of quiet determination. Not to prove anything, just to pay attention. I wanted to be sure I wasn't missing something obvious because of exhaustion or stress. The shift was busy enough to keep me grounded. New admission early in the night, family anxious and asking questions. I explained comfort. Care reassured them. answered the same concerns I'd answered hundreds of times. Their fear was familiar. It reminded me why I'd chosen hospice in the first place. Later, when things slowed down, I checked on the patients who were declining fastest, not hovering, just observing, watching their breathing, their expressions, their responses to my voice. One woman squeezed my hand when I spoke to her, even though she hadn't opened her eyes in hours. That wasn't unusual. Touch can trigger reflexes long after speech is gone. I documented it and moved on. But I noticed something else too. Several patients became more alert when I spoke their names, not fully responsive, just present, like they were still aware of being addressed even when everything else was shutting down. That awareness lingered longer than I expected. At the nurse's station, I caught myself hesitating before closing charts, double-checking times, reviewing notes more than once, not because anything was wrong, but because I wanted to be certain. Dr. Reynolds passed by again during his rounds. We exchanged small talk about staffing shortages and how hard it had been to keep overnight nurses lately. That was true everywhere. Night shifts burn people out fast. I almost brought up my concerns again, but I stopped myself. There was nothing new to report, no new incident, just questions without evidence. That's not how medicine works. You don't present questions without data. You wait until there's something concrete. Still, the idea that I might have contributed to someone's death in a way I didn't understand sat heavy in my chest. Guilt doesn't need proof to take root. It just needs doubt. When my shift ended, I drove home in silence, radio off, windows cracked, to let in the cold air. It helped me stay alert. It helped me think. I wondered how many nurses had felt this way and never talked about it, how many quietly carried moments they couldn't categorize and learned to live with them. Healthcare culture doesn't reward uncertainty. It rewards confidence. Even when that confidence is borrowed, I started paying attention to my colleagues in a new way. The ones who avoided night shifts, the ones who transferred units without explanation, the ones who joked too much about death like it was a defense mechanism. I'd always assumed burnout was the reason. Long hours, emotional strain, low pay, all of that was true, but now I wasn't so sure it explained everything. That afternoon before my next shift, I pulled up internal records at work. Not patient charts, incident logs, staff notes, the kind of documentation no one reads unless there's a problem. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I just wanted context, a sense of whether what I'd experienced fit into a larger pattern or stood alone. Most of what I found was boring. Staffing issues, equipment maintenance, scheduling changes, exactly what you'd expect. Then I noticed a handful of entries that used vague language. Notes about unusual patient behavior near time of death. No details, no follow-up, no conclusions. The dates were spread out, different nurses, different patients, all overnight shifts. I closed the system and sat back in my chair, heart beating a little faster than before. Not because I felt validated, but because I didn't. There was still no explanation, just a growing sense that whatever I'd seen wasn't unique enough to be dismissed as imagination, but not clear enough to be addressed openly. When I walked back onto the unit that night, the lights dimmed and the hallway quiet, I felt something I hadn't felt in years of nursing. I felt watched, not by anything specific, not by a presence or a figure, just by the weight of unanswered questions that seemed to linger in places where life was ending, waiting to see if anyone would notice them long enough to start asking the wrong kind of questions. I didn't go looking for answers because I wanted to prove something. I went looking because ignoring questions has never been one of my strengths. That's not a great trait for a nurse, but it's a common one. If something doesn't sit right, you check it. Then you check it again. The internal system wasn't designed for curiosity. It was designed for accountability. Everything logged had a purpose, usually tied to compliance audits or liability. That meant anything vague stood out immediately. I started with records from my own unit, limiting the search to overnight shifts over the past few years. The first dozen entries were exactly what I expected. Medication adjustments, family complaints, equipment checks, nothing unusual. Then I saw one note that made me stop scrolling. Patient exhibited unexpected vocalization following cessation of respiration. No intervention required. No name in the summary view. Just a timestamp and the initials of the nurse who'd written it. The wording was careful, neutral. It didn't say what the vocalization was or how long it lasted, just that it happened. I clicked into the full entry. The details didn't expand much. Time of death documented, comfort measures provided, no deviation from protocol. The note felt deliberately unfinished, like the writer had said just enough to protect themselves without committing to an explanation. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. One vague note didn't mean anything. Everyone documents differently. Some nurses write novels, others write just enough to get through chart review. I kept looking. There were more. Not many, not enough to form an obvious pattern, but enough to unsettle me. Different patients, different diagnoses, different nurses. The language shifted slightly from note to note, but the tone stayed the same. Involuntary movement observed after death pronounced. Brief post-mortem response noted. Unexpected motor activity. Patient remained deceased. No alarms triggered. No codes called. No follow-up assessments ordered. Every entry ended the same way. Care completed. Shift continued. I recognized some of the names attached to those notes. Nurses I'd worked with. Nurses I trusted. Not dramatic people. Not the type to exaggerate. I checked the dates, spread out over several years. Always overnight. Always hospice. Always near the exact moment death was documented. I closed the system and sat still for a moment, listening to the hum of the building around me. The sounds were familiar, comforting even, but the feeling in my chest wasn't. What bothered me most wasn't what the notes said, it was what they didn't. None of them described fear. None of them used emotional language. They read like professionals acknowledging something and then deliberately moving past it. That's a skill you learn in healthcare. You document the facts and leave the rest out. Feelings complicate records. Complications invite questions. I checked my own charting history out of curiosity. My notes were clean, conservative, exactly what management expects. I'd never written anything like those entries before. Now I understood why. If I had documented what I'd seen in Eleanor's room or with the man who died later that week, it would have raised questions I didn't want to answer. Not because I didn't believe what I'd seen, but because I couldn't explain it. And unexplained things don't belong in medical records. That realization sat heavy with me as I went back to work. The unit was busy that night. New admissions, families cycling in and out, doctors making brief appearances before heading home. Everything felt normal on the surface. That was the most unsettling part. Life and death continued exactly as they always had, regardless of what I'd discovered. I started paying attention to how other nurses behaved during end-of-life moments. Not intrusively, just observantly, who stayed in the room longer than necessary, who avoided eye contact afterward, who cracked jokes to break the tension. I noticed one nurse younger than me hesitate before closing a patient's eyes after death. Her hand hovered there for a second longer than needed. She didn't say anything. She didn't look around. She just did it and moved on. I wondered if she'd seen something before. That thought made me uncomfortable, so I pushed it away. Assumptions aren't evidence. I reminded myself of that repeatedly. Later that night, during a quiet stretch, I reopened the record system. This time, I widened the search beyond my unit. Other hospice facilities in the same network, same type of care, same policies. The results were similar, sparse, vague, rare, but present. I found one note written by a nurse who no longer worked with us. I remembered her vaguely. She transferred out after less than a year. No drama, no explanation. Her note read, observed coordinated movement after pronouncement, unable to classify, equipment functioning normally. That one sentence made my heart rate spike. Coordinated movement. That wasn't accidental phrasing. Nurses don't use that term lightly. Coordination implies intent, or at least structure. I checked whether there had been any follow-up. There hadn't. No incident report, no management note, no disciplinary action, nothing. The system treated it like a blip that didn't require acknowledgement. I logged out and sat there longer than necessary, my mind racing in directions I didn't want it to go. This wasn't a ghost story. This wasn't even a mystery in the traditional sense. It was something quieter. It was evidence that people were seeing things they couldn't explain and choosing not to talk about them in any meaningful way. I thought about the culture of medicine again. How much emphasis is placed on certainty, on protocols, on confidence. Admitting uncertainty isn't encouraged unless you're actively seeking a diagnosis. There's no diagnostic code for doubt. I finished my shift on autopilot, charted carefully, interacted professionally, smiled when appropriate. No one noticed anything different about me. Driving home, I replayed the records in my head. The careful wording, the lack of conclusions, the way every note stopped just short of saying too much. I realized then that whatever this was, it wasn't something new. It wasn't something that had started with Eleanor or with me. It had been happening quietly, sporadically, just often enough for people to notice and just rarely enough for them to dismiss it as coincidence. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a moment before getting out. The house was dark, quiet, normal. I wondered how many nurses carried memories like this home with them and learned to live around them instead of confronting them. How many chose silence because speaking up would change nothing and only make their work harder. By the time I stepped inside, I knew one thing with uncomfortable clarity. Whatever I had seen was not unique, and the system I worked in was very good at making sure it stayed that way. I didn't plan to talk to anyone about what I'd found in the records. Reaching out felt unnecessary, and unnecessary conversations in healthcare tend to create problems. Still, the names I recognized kept circling in my head, especially one I hadn't seen in years. Michelle Arden. She'd worked hospice nights briefly before transferring out of state. No incident, no explanation, just gone. I found her number through an old internal contact list that should have been deleted but never was. That too felt familiar. Hospitals are full of outdated systems holding on to things longer than they should. I stared at the number for a full minute before calling, half expecting it to be disconnected. She answered on the third ring. I told her who I was and where I was calling from. There was a pause on the line, not long enough to be awkward, but long enough to register. When she spoke again, her voice was careful, polite, guarded. We talked about neutral things first: work, staffing shortages, how difficult hospice night shifts had become everywhere. She mentioned she was doing outpatient work now. Daytime hours, predictable schedules, less stress. I asked her why she'd left hospice. Another pause, longer this time. She didn't say anything dramatic, no stories, no claims, just a sentence that landed heavier than anything else she could have said. I stopped sleeping. I waited, letting the silence do its work. Nurses know how to do that. Eventually, she continued. She said night shifts had started to blur together, not because of exhaustion, but because she couldn't shake certain moments, small ones, the kind you don't write reports about, the kind you don't bring up in meetings. I asked her if she meant unusual patient behavior near death. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she asked me why I was calling. I told her the truth, or at least the part of it that felt safe. I said I'd seen a few things that didn't sit right. I said I'd found records that suggested other nurses had noticed similar things. I didn't use words like unexplained or impossible. I kept it clinical. She exhaled slowly, like she'd been holding her breath without realizing it. "Do you remember that man in room 7? She asked. I did, vaguely. Different patient, different time, but I remembered the room. She said she'd been on shift the night he died. Advanced cancer, expected, peaceful. Nothing remarkable until after the monitor went flat. She didn't say what she saw right away. She talked around it, choosing words carefully. She said the room felt occupied longer than it should have. Not physically, just present, like the air hadn't settled yet. That phrasing stuck with me. She said she told herself it was adrenaline, or stress, or imagination. That explanation worked for a while. Then it happened again with another patient weeks later. She didn't document either incident beyond standard notes. No one told her to. No one asked questions. The system moved on. "What did you actually see?" I asked. She hesitated. "He moved," she said finally. Not like a reflex, not like a twitch, just enough that I noticed. I asked her how long it lasted. "Too long," she said. "Long enough that I couldn't convince myself it was nothing." We didn't talk about ghosts or souls or anything that sounded irrational. We talked like nurses do, about protocols, about what should happen, about what we're trained to ignore. She told me she started dreading certain hours of the night, that window between 2 and 4 when most deaths seem to occur. She began volunteering to switch shifts, taking days, making excuses. Eventually, she left hospice entirely. I asked her if she'd ever talked to a doctor about it. She laughed softly. Not amused, just tired. "What would I say?" she asked. That something felt off. Doctors don't document feelings. Neither do nurses, not officially. Before we ended the call, she said one thing that stayed with me. "I stopped trying to understand it," she said. "I just knew I didn't want to be there when it happened again." After we hung up, I sat at the nurse's station longer than necessary, staring at the blank charting screen. The unit around me moved quietly, unaware of the shift happening in my head. Michelle hadn't confirmed anything. She hadn't explained anything. But she hadn't dismissed it either. That mattered. Over the next few weeks, I paid closer attention to staff turnover. Night nurses rarely lasted. Transfers were common. Resignations quiet. Exit interviews vague. Burnout explained most of it. That's what management said. That's what we all accepted. But now I heard something else underneath those explanations. A shared reluctance. A collective decision not to stay too long. I watched newer nurses during end-of-life moments. How some avoided the room after death, how others lingered longer than necessary, like they were waiting for something to settle. No one talked about it. No one needed to. I thought again about Eleanor Price, her certainty, her awareness, her timing. I thought about the man whose jaw had moved, the coordinated nature of it, the way it hadn't felt random. None of these moments proved anything on their own. Taken together, they suggested something harder to dismiss. Not a phenomenon, not a theory, just a gap. A gap between what we know and what we experience. A gap wide enough for doubt to take root. I didn't change how I worked. Not outwardly. I followed protocols, documented carefully, provided the same level of care I always had. But I started noticing when nurses chose silence over explanation, when they used humor to deflect discomfort, when they avoided certain rooms without saying why. Healthcare is full of unspoken rules. One of them is knowing which questions not to ask. By the time another patient entered the active dying phase on my shift, I was already standing a little closer than usual, watching a little longer, listening for things I used to tune out. Not because I expected answers, but because I'd learned that whatever this was, it didn't announce itself loudly. It showed up in small, easily dismissed moments, and then waited to see who was paying enough attention to feel unsettled by them. And that awareness had become impossible to turn off. I noticed the decision forming before I admitted it to myself. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It showed up in small ways, like how I lingered in my car before walking into the building, or how I checked the schedule twice to confirm I was assigned another overnight shift. Those weren't things I used to do. Night shifts had been routine, almost automatic. Now they required effort. The first clear sign came during a staff meeting I barely listened to. Management was discussing staffing gaps, asking for volunteers to pick up extra nights. A few nurses avoided eye contact. A few others stared at the table. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anxiety, but resistance. My hand stayed firmly in my lap. That surprised me. I had always been reliable. The nurse who filled in when others couldn't, the one supervisors counted on. I took pride in that. Realizing I no longer wanted to be that person unsettled me more than anything I'd seen on the unit. Later that night, a patient began actively declining. Middle-aged woman, metastatic breast cancer, family present earlier, now gone home to rest. I did everything right. Comfort meds administered, oxygen adjusted, lights dimmed. I sat with her while her breathing slowed, counting each rise and fall. As I watched her, I felt a familiar sense of detachment settle in, that professional distance nurses rely on. It usually keeps you functional. This time it felt thin. When her breathing stopped, I followed protocol exactly. Waited, checked, confirmed. Time of death documented. No movement, no unexpected sounds, nothing out of place. And yet, as I stood there, I felt the same hesitation I'd felt before, the same awareness that lingered after the moment had passed. The room didn't feel empty right away. I didn't see anything. That almost made it worse. Back at the nurse's station, I stared at the chart, longer than necessary, cursor blinking like it was waiting for something I wasn't going to type. My documentation was clean, accurate, professional. It always was. That's when it hit me that the problem wasn't what I was seeing. It was what I was feeling responsible for. Hospice nurses carry a unique kind of weight. We don't cure. We manage. We guide people through the last phase of their lives with medication, reassurance, and presence. There's an unspoken understanding that we're helping them let go. What I couldn't shake was the question of timing, of awareness, of whether the body and whatever else might be present always line up the way textbooks suggest. I started wondering if comfort care sometimes moved faster than awareness, if we were easing physical pain while something else struggled to catch up. That thought felt dangerous. Not because it was mystical, but because it challenged the assumptions my entire career rested on. I brought the idea up cautiously with Dr. Reynolds during a quiet moment, not as a claim, just as a philosophical question. He listened politely, then reminded me that medicine works with measurable data. What can't be measured can't guide care. He wasn't wrong. He was also done with the conversation. Driving home that morning, I knew something fundamental had shifted. Not in my beliefs, but in my tolerance. I could continue working hospice nights and learn to live with that uncertainty, or I could remove myself from it. I chose the second option. The decision wasn't framed as fear. I didn't tell anyone I was disturbed or overwhelmed. I cited sleep issues, burnout, a desire for more predictable hours, all things management understands. When I submitted my transfer request, it was approved quickly, too quickly, like they'd been expecting it. My last overnight shift passed quietly. No unusual events, no moments that demanded explanation. That almost felt like an insult, as if the unit was proving it could function perfectly without revealing anything at all. I said my goodbyes in the way healthcare workers do. Briefly, casually, no speeches, no confessions, just reassurances that we'd run into each other again. On my first day working daytime clinic hours, the difference was immediate. Fluorescent lights, full waiting rooms, conversations about lab results and follow-up appointments, life moving forward instead of winding down. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt disconnected, like I'd stepped out of a space where something important was happening even if I didn't understand it. Over time, the intensity faded, my sleep improved, the constant edge dulled. I stopped waking up at 2 a.m. without knowing why. That felt like progress, but some things didn't return to baseline. I found myself avoiding hospice facilities entirely. Even when they were the fastest route somewhere, I took longer roads. I avoided conversations about end-of-life care. Not because I rejected it, but because I no longer trusted my assumptions about it. Occasionally, I ran into former coworkers who still worked nights. They looked tired, more tired than before. When I asked how things were going, the answers were always the same. Fine, busy, short-staffed. No one elaborated. I stopped asking. What stayed with me wasn't a specific image or sound. It was the awareness that medicine operates within boundaries we don't always acknowledge. That there are moments when the body stops responding, but something else hasn't finished processing the transition. I don't claim to know what that something is. I don't label it. I don't need to. What I know is this. Leaving hospice nights didn't feel like quitting. It felt like stepping away from a question I wasn't equipped to answer without changing how I practice medicine. And I wasn't willing to risk that. Even now, working in a setting where life continues instead of ending, I carry that awareness with me. It informs how I speak to patients, how I explain procedures, how I think about the space between measurable data and lived experience. I still believe in medicine. I still trust doctors. I still rely on protocols. I've just accepted that there are moments when those systems reach their limits, and the people closest to the end are the ones who sense it first. Walking out of hospice nights didn't erase what I'd noticed. It simply gave me enough distance to function again, knowing that some aspects of death don't fit neatly into charts, and that sometimes the most responsible choice a nurse can make is recognizing when staying too close to those moments comes at a cost they're no longer willing to pay. I didn't talk about hospice much after I left night shifts. When people asked where I'd worked before moving to clinic hours, I gave short answers. Hospice, palliative care, end-of-life support. Most people didn't push further. Death makes conversations uncomfortable, and Americans are good at changing subjects when things get too real. My days became predictable in a way they hadn't been for years. Morning appointments, lab reviews, medication refills, patients worried about cholesterol numbers and blood pressure readings, problems with solutions, questions with answers. I hadn't realized how much I missed that clarity until it returned. From the outside, it probably looked like I'd recovered from burnout. I slept through the night again. I laughed more. I stopped checking clocks without meaning to. Friends commented that I seemed lighter, more like myself. They weren't wrong, but they weren't fully right either. There are things hospice teaches you that don't disappear when you change jobs. You become attuned to subtle shifts in people. You notice pauses, hesitations, the way someone chooses words when they're afraid of what comes next. That part of me stayed sharp. What changed was how I interpreted those moments. Before, I believed death was a clear boundary, a line you cross and don't come back from. The body fails, the systems stop, and whatever makes a person who they are shuts down with it. That belief made hospice manageable. It turned something overwhelming into something procedural. Now, I'm not so sure the line is as clean as we pretend it is. I don't believe I saw ghosts. I don't think Eleanor Price was trying to communicate from beyond anything. I don't think patients were conscious in a way science would recognize after death. Those explanations feel lazy to me, too easy. What I believe is simpler and more unsettling. I think awareness fades unevenly. Medicine is very good at measuring organs, heart rate, oxygen levels, brain activity. We treat consciousness like it's a switch either on or off. But anyone who has watched a person die knows it doesn't feel like that. It feels gradual, fragmented, like different parts of a system shutting down at different speeds. I think sometimes awareness lingers longer than we expect. Not thought, not identity, just presence. A last echo of being there, aware enough to register a voice, a name, a moment before it dissolves. That idea doesn't violate biology. It just doesn't fit neatly into how we prefer to talk about death. Hospice care is designed to make dying comfortable, pain controlled, anxiety managed. The body eased toward its conclusion. That's important work, necessary work. I still believe in it, but I also believe that comfort doesn't always align perfectly with awareness, that sometimes the body reaches its endpoint before whatever part of us experiences the world fully disengages. If that's true, then those moments I witnessed weren't errors or anomalies. They were glimpses of a transition we don't fully understand and don't have language for. I don't lose sleep over that anymore. I've accepted that not every question needs an answer to be acknowledged. What still bothers me is how rarely this is discussed among professionals, not because it's dangerous, but because it's inconvenient. It complicates care. It introduces uncertainty into a field built on confidence. I understand why nurses don't talk about it, why doctors don't pursue it. There's no clear benefit, no protocol to change, no outcome to improve, and yet the silence feels dishonest. Every few months, I run into someone from Silver Willows or another hospice facility. The conversations follow a familiar script. Staffing shortages, budget cuts, night shifts no one wants. I've learned to listen for what isn't said. Recently, a former coworker mentioned they'd hired 3 new night nurses in less than a year. None of them stayed. She shrugged it off as burnout. Long hours, emotional toll. I didn't argue. I don't think people leave hospice nights because they're weak. I think they leave because prolonged exposure to unanswered questions wears you down in ways you can't chart or medicate. I still drive past Silver Willows occasionally. The building looks the same, quiet, unassuming. If you didn't know what happened inside, you'd never give it a second thought. That feels appropriate. Death doesn't advertise itself. Sometimes when I pass it late at night, I wonder who's on shift. Whether they're sitting at the nurse's station, listening to monitors, telling themselves everything makes sense. I hope they're right. I haven't returned to hospice work, and I don't plan to. Not because I'm afraid, but because I know my limits. I know that staying close to that edge too long changes how you see everything else. What I took with me instead was a different approach to care. I slow down when patients speak, even if what they're saying doesn't seem important. I use names more intentionally. I don't rush silence. I treat the end of things with more caution than certainty. I don't claim insight into what happens after death. I don't offer theories or comfort based on belief. When patients ask me what I think, I tell them the truth. I tell them I believe something continues for a little while, but I don't know what form it takes. I tell them medicine understands a lot, but not everything. And I tell them that being unsure doesn't mean being careless. Most people accept that. Some find it unsettling. A few seem relieved. What stays with me most isn't fear, it's respect. For the process, for the people passing through it, for the quiet moments we usually rush past because they don't fit into our schedules. If there's one thing hospice taught me that I carry into every exam room, now it's this. The end of life isn't always a moment. Sometimes it's a stretch of time we don't fully acknowledge where awareness fades unevenly and certainty becomes optional. That doesn't make medicine weaker, it makes it more honest. And when I think back to Eleanor Price, to the way she said my name, to the calm certainty in her voice, I don't feel haunted. I feel reminded. Reminded that even in places designed for endings, not everything stops at once. Some things linger just long enough to be noticed by the people trained to stay present until the very end, whether or not they're prepared for what that presence might reveal. I don't tell this story to scare anyone, and I don't tell it to challenge medicine. I still believe in hospitals and doctors and in the systems that save lives every day. I still trust science training and experience. Those things matter. They always will. But after working so long as a nurse, especially in hospice care, I've learned that not every part of human experience fits neatly into charts, protocols, or explanations. Some moments live in the quiet space between what doctors can measure and what nurses quietly witness, and those moments tend to stay with you. This isn't a ghost story, it's one of many nurses' stories that never make it into official reports because there's nowhere to put them. They don't change treatment plans, they don't affect outcomes, but they change the people who are there when life is ending. What I took away from my time in hospice wasn't fear, it was humility. An understanding that medicine is powerful but not complete, that listening matters just as much as knowing, and that sometimes the most important thing a nurse can do is simply stay present even when there are no answers. If you've ever worked in a hospital or alongside doctors and nurses, you may understand exactly what I mean. And if you haven't, I hope this story gave you a glimpse into a part of healthcare most people never see. If you want to hear more real hospital stories and nurses' stories like this, told honestly and without exaggeration, consider subscribing to the channel. These are the stories that don't end when the monitors go quiet, and they deserve to be told.